appearance of cold anomalies and an emergence of more warm anomalies, and especially some really warm anomalies, such that in each of these years, between 5 and 13% of the globe in any of the given years is covered by greater than 3 standard deviation warm events. Look at 2010, for example, the warmest year on record. 13% of the globe was covered by extreme warm events that were more than 3 standard deviations above normal, and we would expect 0.25% of the globe to be covered by that. This also says that in any given year, it won't be hot in your region necessarily, but it's likely to be hot somewhere else, and it's shifting around in any given year. This year, Australia just shattered previous records. In 2010, Russia had some real problems. 2012 was America's turn. So in any given year, it may pop up like bubble up somewhere else, these warm pools, but the increasing amount is towards increased extreme temperatures. We can also detect human activity in a signal on the amount of forest fire burnt. We can start to say that more and more areas of forest fires are occurring. Greater areas are being burnt by forest fires as a consequence of human activity because of the increased warming and the effect that has on summertime moisture. We can start to detect human contributions on increasing extreme precipitation events. And we could even now pose the question and answer the question what the likelihood of these massive flooding events that we're seeing occurring, what the likelihood of them occurring in the absence of global warming would have been. So this then brings us to the future and really boiling this whole question down into one question. And that's illustrated by this figure here, which I really like. It's showing 2 columns and 3 rows. And in each of the row is demonstrating what the projected change in temperatures are for 3 different scenarios of future greenhouse gas emissions. The top is relatively benign growth. The middle is essentially 1% per year, or business as usual, as it used to be usual growth. And the bottom one is business as usual now growth. And when the first panel shows a projected change relative to 1980 to 1999 over the period 2020 to 2029, and the second one is at the end of the century. And why this is so valuable a figure is that when you look very carefully at the first 3 columns, it's very difficult to discern any differences at all. That is, it's about 0.2 degrees per decade warming, independent of the emissions trajectory. Whereas when you look at the latter part, the warming that arises is very sensitive to the emissions pathway that was taken. And what this is doing, in some sense, is boiling the whole question of global warming, the whole question of whether or not we want to deal with this, to a question of intergenerational equity. Do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of environment that they inherit? It's a legitimate question that society needs to get a handle on, and many people will have a diversity of views. Some will say no, some will say yes, many will say I don't care. But this is the question, because you can see in the first column, the decisions we make today are not going to affect those who make the decisions today. But decisions that we make today will affect the next generation who are not here now to be part of the decision-making process. It's a very grand ethical challenge, which also points to why it's such a difficult political issue, because most politicians are thinking about decisions that have effects on 4-year electoral cycles. So this is mostly youth here. So it's a mixed audience. So what I typically do if it's youth or general public, I say, how many of you are thinking about hip and knee replacements? And typically it's with the youth there's nobody, and in generally the grayer the hair, the more hands go up. But if I'm a politician and I realize that between 70 and 80% of people over the age of 65 vote, and between 30 and 40% of youth vote, and I'm thinking about issues that I can point to, I'll think, hip replacement lineups, knee replacement lineups, you're living in pain, let's reduce those lineups. You can spend some money, 4 years later, lineups are reduced. Look, I listened to you, the people. You're no longer living in pain, vote me back in. That's a demographic coming out to vote, you're appealing to your base, off they go. But what about people who are saying, you know what, I'm going to put in carbon pricing, the single most important and effective means of dealing with this problem, and it's going to have no effect on your lifetime, those of you who need a hip replacement, but it's going to have an effect on those who aren't showing up to vote. It's a difficult political decision, which is why it's so important, I believe, to support those who actually do make decisions with the better long-term interests in mind. And that's one of the reasons why I was so supportive of Premier Campbell when he actually brought these policies forward, because there's many issues you can have with Premier Campbell, but one of the things he did do here was actually bring forward climate policy that would have a long-term, whose influence would be felt in the long term. In terms of precipitation, there's also well-known, well-understood issues that we expect as a community. You can boil it down to pithy quotes like wetter regions get wetter and drier regions get drier, or it increases the likelihood of extreme precipitation goes up. When it rains, it increasingly likely rains in bigger amounts, increased likelihood of summer drought particularly. And so there's a bunch of things you can say here, but when you look at these maps, what's fascinating is it's as if somehow the 49th parallel is the transition in color from dry to wet. And what this is saying from a Canadian perspective is water availability in the US is going to be a substantial issue of concern for them in the decades ahead. It's already a concern in California this year. And at some point, water excess will be a continued and growing concern in the north, and you can start to see pipeline discussions emerging, not about bitumen, ironically about water as a consequence of the combustion of such fossil fuel products. So what are the reasons for concern? Why do we care about this? Okay, let's suppose we do care about intergenerational equity. To me, the whole reason why we care about the issue of climate change it can be summarized into two ways. One is global security and political instability. 80% of the cumulative emissions have come from past emissions have come from the developed world, but the impacts of global warming are disproportionately felt by the developing world. And this sows the seeds of discontent. I didn't cause a problem, you caused the problem, it's affecting me, what am I going to do about it? Developed nations also have the technological and economic ability to adapt or to assist and adapt, and developed nations typically don't have it. So we have a global security, political instability, and global ethical issue. And of course the issue of dealing with environmental refugees. But another, of course, is the response of natural ecosystems. The change in store over this decade is simply far too fast, far too rapid for many of our natural ecosystems to adapt. Their natural adaptation is typically on much longer timescales. So in the previous IPC assessment, there were some estimates of the type of extinction that could occur as a consequence of future warming, such that you get very large numbers of potential species becoming committed to extinction depending on the level of future warming from today. 3.3 degree further warming, somewhere between 40 and 70% was the estimate of world species becoming committed to extinction. And particularly in the ocean, where you start to have ocean acidity becoming a real concern. So where is Canada on the international scene? Well, we like to think of ourselves as global brokers of peace, and goodwill. Canada, as a per capita emitter, is number 14th. The average person in Canada emits about 4.2 tons of carbon per year, and the average person, in terms of overall, we are the 8th overall emitter. That while China is the first, US the second, we are the 8th overall emitter as a nation, well ahead of such countries as Brazil, Indonesia, and others, which are much, much larger in terms of their population. Per capita, an individual in Iceland emits 2.4 times less carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than a Canadian. An average person in Sweden, 3.3 times less. An average person in Ethiopia, 140 times less than the average person in Canada. So you can imagine some of the issues that arise when Canada stands up in United Nations forums and says that we'll be part of an agreement if everyone's part of an agreement, and you have a delegation from Ethiopia going, say what? It really is something unpalatable for many when those who have created the problem and have much greater per capita emissions are not willing to actually take leadership in dealing with it. The trends in emissions, unfortunately, are growing. They're growing at a rate of about 3% per year now. If you go back and track the people who have been offended about the science and have written opinion editorials to various newspapers. And you go back to the late 1990s, one of the big criticisms that was being made at the time was climate models are using an estimated emissions growth of 1% per year, which is way overestimating what is actually happening. In fact, it's way underestimating of what actually transpired, the growth of 3% per year in recent years. If we look then at where the emissions are coming from, historically, the developed world, these are so-called Annex A, Annex B nations, such as Canada, US, Japan, Europe, etc. 65% of global emissions came from the developed world and 35% from the developing world, and now that's almost switched. Emissions from places like Canada, the US have stabilized, and emissions growth is now currently occurring, particularly in Japan, in China, such that Chinese emissions growth year over year, 2011 to 2010, was 10% increase in emissions. And a variety of other countries, India was up, US was down. In fact, in Obama's State of the Union speech, he pointed out, rightly so, that the US has had emissions drop more than any other nation in the world since he took office in the first time. So there have been changes there, and we'll come to that again, and so on, so on, so forth. Let's just skip that. The only international policy that we have left on the table is that nations have agreed to hold temperatures to below 2 degrees warming from pre-industrial times. Well, they haven't agreed, they've taken note of that, whatever that means. And as part of this, they've submitted voluntary emissions reduction targets. So what do we know as a scientific community? If every country in the world met its emissions target that it voluntarily submitted with no penalties for not meeting it, 2-degree measure would almost certainly be broken this century, with 50-50 chance of 3 degrees being broken this century and 4 degrees following thereafter. There's an absolutely profound disconnect between science and policy at the international and national level. So while I paint a very negative picture here, it doesn't need to be a negative picture because all the solutions, I would argue, are there. And they fall in 3 categories. There's technological solutions, there's behavioral solutions, and there's market instruments, which I truly believe are necessary for the first 2 to actually take off. So let's look at the latter to start off with, and we'll do the analogy of the tragedy of the commons. So let's suppose there's a piece of land that a bunch of farmers are sharing, and the land is owned by the crown or the people, and the cows are owned by the individual farmers. So let's suppose I'm a farmer and I want to determine whether I should put another cow on this land. So I'm going to do a cost-benefit analysis, and I do the following. The benefits of adding a cow on the land are reaped by me exclusively because I own the cow. But the costs of any overgrazing are distributed to everybody. So that the costs are distributed, benefits me. Cost-benefit analysis, I should put a cow on the land. But every farmer could think the same way, that it's always to a farmer's advantage from a traditional cost-benefit analysis to put another cow on this land. And there's only one equilibrium solution of this problem, and that is a collapse. It leads to a collapse. Now let's take it into the climate problem. The atmosphere is the shared mother of all tragedies of the commons. It's shared by everybody. So it's in every country's best interest to do absolutely nothing because the costs of action are borne by the country and the costs of inaction are distributed amongst 7 billion people. So it's in every province's best interest to do nothing. It's in every city and every province in every country and in the world's best interest to do nothing. It's in every municipality in every city and every province in every country in the world's best interest to do absolutely nothing. It's in every household in every municipality in every city in every province in every country in the world's best interest to do absolutely nothing. And in fact, it's in every individual, in every household, in every municipality, in every city, in every province, in every country in the world's best interest to do absolutely nothing about this problem. Because the costs of action are borne by the individual and the costs of inaction are distributed amongst 7 point whatever billion people in the world. The mother of all tragedy of the commons. There's only one solution. We don't do anything and away we go. So, how do we deal with this? Well, let's go back to the tragedy of the commons with the cows. The farmers might recognize, based on experience down road, that this is a problem, so they need to elect some kind of governing body that will deal with this problem. So they might elect a council. And this council might then think about, well, how are we going to do this? There's a cost involved. Let's regulate the number of cows. So we'll say that we know that this land can support 100 cows, and then we divvy out the cows. So because I like you, you get a cow, and you voted for me, you get 3 cows, and you donated to my party, you get 4 cows, and you're the opposition, so you get no cows. So you divvy it up, and there's 100 cows. Regulation often is a means and ways of doing it. Of course, it's open to criticism, to potential corruption, et cetera, but it's certainly one way of getting involved in dealing with it. Another is to say, you know what, let's use the market. We realize that 100 cows can live on this land, so we're going to issue 100 permits to put a cow on this land, and we're going to let you auction off the right to put a cow on this land, let the market determine the price to put a cow on this land. And we can determine what we do with the money, yet, we might be able to build fences with it, or we might give it back to people, or reduce other taxes. But we're letting the market determine the price. We've capped the cows, and we allow the markets to buy and sell permits. And this is exactly what we do with taxi cabs in a city. You issue a number of taxi cabs, permits, you buy a permit, you can drive a cab, you buy and sell permits. The market is setting the price. The climate system, the cow system is happy because they know exactly how many cows are on the land. 100 cows, no more. Sometimes industry might, the farmers might be a little cagey about this because it's giving them price uncertainty, even though the environment's happy because it's giving them cow certainty. But now we have another option. We could put a head tax on the cow. Instead of capping the number of cows, we say it's going to cost you $10 to put a cow in the land. And you start collecting money and you realize, oh my goodness, there's a whole bunch of people putting cows on the land. So you start to increase the price to stop people from putting cows on the land. You can control the number of cows by price. So now business is a little happier because they have some price certainty, but the cow sphere is less happy because you can't control cows as easily. But in both cases, what they're doing is they're internalizing the costs of the behavior of the farmers, or internalizing externalities in the lingo of the economists, and making you pay the true cost of your behavior. Now, in the climate system, it's exactly the same. You could regulate, thou shalt emit so much carbon, thou shalt emit so much carbon, thou shalt have a permit to emit so much, or you could cap the amount. This is called cap and trade. You say, heavy emitters, you're allowed to emit this much, and then you let the market set the price. You have certainty on emissions, the market sets the price, and the market then finds the quickest and cheapest ways of reducing emissions. And the third way is you put a carbon tax on. And then you actually then you give price certainty to the market, but you have less certainty on emissions. In all cases, they're internalizing externalities and they're putting a price on emissions. And it's making you pay the true cost of the behavior. And I would argue it's the only way, I think most economists would argue, the only way in Western democracies, in democratic societies, that we will actually deal with this problem is by introducing carbon pricing, first and foremost. What happened in British Columbia, there's actually strong evidence for this. I cut it out of this talk, but the evidence is that post-2009, when the carbon tax was introduced in BC, not only did our emissions per capita drop greater than, I believe, any other province, I think it was 10% per capita, whereas the rest of Canada was just under 1% since it was introduced. Dramatic drop in transportation emissions, dramatic conversion of heating oil to natural gas, et cetera. And at the same time, our economy performed better than other jurisdictions in Canada and then the rest of Canada. So it did not have an effect on our economy, despite the fear-mongering that was out there. At the same time, British Columbia there was a report commissioned and released by KPMG assessing the clean tech sector. This is a sector involved in the technological solutions, the sector involved in the generation, transportation, storage, and end use of renewable energy. There were 202 clean tech organizations identified in BC, which in 2011 had increased in terms of revenue from $1.6 billion in 2008 to $2.5 billion in 2011. There were 8,400 jobs in the area. In fact, there's 4 times as many jobs in this sector than there is in the oil and gas sector in British Columbia, which is, people don't know that. There's 4 times as many jobs in the film industry as the oil and gas and mining sectors combined in British Columbia. And the summary was here that while still young, the BC clean tech sector was showing tremendous opportunity for growth. It's a sector worth encouraging and promoting globally. It creates high-paying jobs and investment opportunities for British Columbians. It's export-oriented, and it's helping to improve the sustainability of the planet. Now, why this is important is this was an industry that started to grow precisely when the signal was sent to the market that if you're going to do business in BC, your going to pay carbon pricing, but at the same time we're using the revenue from that to reduce taxation in other aspects of our system through personal income tax and business tax reductions. So BC became a friendly place for business to grow, and a really friendly place for business to grow that was involved in a sector that was not creating emissions, which is why this took off. But we won't go there just yet. U.S. has recognized this. In March of this year, in the LA Times, there was a very fine story about the U.S. green job growth, and pointed out that there were 3.4 million green energy jobs in the U.S. in 2011, 2.6% of all employment, which had increased by 4.9% from 2010, 4 times the rate of overall job growth in the U.S. And there was massive investments starting to happen in this clean energy business and development, and it increasing quite dramatically. And one of the reasons why, of course, is in the stimulus funding that was being done in the U.S., President Obama recognized that if you're going to introduce stimulus funding, let's do it for tomorrow's economy, not yesterday's economy. So whereas in Canada we built roads and bridges, in the US they invested heavily in clean tech. I actually think that this is an incredibly exciting age for youth of today, an exciting age of innovation for this sector, the sector involved in the generation, transportation, storage, and end use. And the reason why is I truly believe that as we solve this problem, and we will require ourselves to transform our energy systems away from those that produce emissions to those that don't, which involves a technological revolution that will make the industrial revolution of the James Watt steam engine era pale in comparison. Let's look at some examples relevant to you. Green building sector, this is from the US data. Single family housing green residential market sector. In 2008, it was 10 billion, 8% of the market. 2013, 32 to 36 billion, 22 to 25% of the market. Projected growth to be up to 29 to 38% of the market by 2016. This is, exponential curves. These are nice. Growth curves, rapid growth curves in the green building tech sector in the US. The electrification of the transportation sector, it's beginning. Despite the fact that we may not see it here in Canada as much, it is certainly beginning. And some jurisdictions are beginning to realize that there's an advantage to be part of it. For example, Quebec has decided that they would like to make heavy investments to use their clean energy to bring industry into their province that actually requires heavy energy consumption, but is also the industries of tomorrow. Like one of their goals is the electrification of the transportation sector. In the Vancouver Sun, just last week, Vaughn Palmer wrote a fascinating piece where he focused on what has happened in Washington and Oregon, 2 jurisdictions just to the south of us, who just like Quebec recognized that they had access to lots of cheap, clean energy, and they attracted major investments from 2 companies, one BMW and one Google. And in BMW, it was to build the carbon fiber components used in their fully electric BMW i3 electric car. And in Oregon, it was a massive Google distribution and storage center, which requires enormous amounts of energy. And Google, being a brand that likes to be known as a clean, an environmentally friendly brand, sought to actually power itself from this clean energy. These are missed opportunities in British Columbia. There are so many others like that. Here's an example of the type of approach, unfortunately, we're heading down in British Columbia relative to where other jurisdictions are going. This is an example of Site C. Now, Site C sounds good if you're sitting in Vancouver and it's up there north, but the people in the region are totally opposed to it because it's destroying the only Class 1 and Class 2 agricultural land north of Quesnel. And they are not happy about doing this to turn the lights on in Vancouver. But we don't need to. Here's the irony. This is very expensive and has a very big environmental footprint. But what we have is already existing wonderful dams. We have a number of them that are generating electricity. Now, dams by themselves, perhaps we need enhanced capacity, although no one's quite sure what the Site C is needed for. But we need enhanced capacity, suppose we do. We view these, rather than just dams producing electricity, we view them as batteries, which are rechargeable. And we have ample supply of the recharging component. Wind by itself is not baseload electricity supply. Wind, when coupled with a storage system, is. Wind coupled with our dams, is. We have in British Columbia some of the most amazing natural resources, whether it be wind, wave, tidal. We even have geothermal capability, yet we're still not taking advantage of this while other jurisdictions move forward. And of course, there's exciting innovation coming down in terms of transmission systems, and particularly high voltage DC systems. There was a company, a Vancouver-based company called Seabreeze, which put out a press release and said that they would be willing to build for free, at no cost, a high voltage DC line between Victoria and the United States if they were able to guarantee I believe it was 10-year contract by BC Hydro to buy electricity from them at 6.9 cents per kilowatt hour. Now it's going to cost over 14 cents per kilowatt hour to build Site C. We're raising rates in British Columbia above 6.9 cents is the lowest incremental rate you pay on your first residential component of your electricity bill. So there's a will with industry to do this, but there has to be a desire within our institutions to allow it to occur. We have built, in my lifetime, in many of your lifetime, a whole system around wireless technology. It didn't exist when I was a kid. It's just, everybody has a cell phone. I actually have two now. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's grown dramatically. We have laptop computers. Some have two. I have two phones, a computer, and an iPad. I mean, this has all happened in the last couple of decades. We've put men on the moon, and we could put women on the moon, but we haven't, but we could. We've put men on the moon, yet we're still driving around in cars powered by an internal combustion engine, which is essentially unchanged from the earliest versions in the Ford Model T, Model E, etc. Think about it. Cell phones, computers, people in space, yet we're still using things that go bang, bang, pistons going up and down. Really, is this the best we can do? I think not. And I think when you think about the reasons why we don't do this, why we don't move away, because it's very difficult at times to introduce new technology into a system that has entrenched existing technology, because the vested interests of the entrenched existing technology will resist the introduction of the new technology. Cell phones in Eastern Europe, cell phones in Africa, cell phones in Asia took off like wildfire. The reason why is they weren't displacing landlines, because people in the small villages simply did not have the resources to bring the wires, the cables, the phones into the village. My wife's village had one phone for the whole village. People would go and line up for the phone and pay an exorbitant amount. Cell phones came in, everybody has a cell phone, because you need one tower for the whole village and the next village. So it is easy, I would argue that this is something that we have to get beyond. And one of the ways of doing that is using market instruments. If we start to price emissions, then we can actually start to shove off that last modern technology. And with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have. Any questions? Yes. Well, I haven't actually touched that from a. I have a whole talk on that. I haven't touched that from an environmental perspective because I don't think you need to. I think the problem with the provincial. Here's what I think has happened, is that in the last election campaign, I don't think anybody thought that the current government had a chance of winning. So a Hail Mary pass was thrown. This is a Hail Mary pass of hope about prosperity for one and all. $1 trillion hit to our GDP, 100,000 jobs, a $100 billion prosperity fund, debt-free BC, no PST. Who wouldn't vote for that? Well, then they won. And now it's like, oh crap. Now we have to deliver. But the reality is, it's a real problem. We just heard from Mike DeYoung that the taxation legislation is being postponed to a fall sitting. The ledge hasn't sat in the fall since as long as I can remember, but the reason why is because it's a very competitive world out there. We have a nice resource in BC, but in fact, Russia has about 20 times the natural gas reserves as we have. Australia has got massive LNG facilities coming online in the next couple of years from Queensland. The US used to be importing natural gas. Doesn't need to. The shale gas revolution. BC isn't the only place in the world that has discovered horizontal fracking. Everyone's discovered it. China has 3 times the shale gas reserves as all of Canada combined, let alone BC. The US has more than twice the shale gas reserves as all of Canada. And the US is ready today, well, not quite today, but pretty close to today, to actually ship instead of import shale gas. And with the Panama Canal widening ready to go this year, it's rock and roll time for the natural gas coming out of the US. So the concern is, well, not a single company yet has made a final investment decision. I actually play a little game. I wonder if I have my Where's Waldo game on this thing here. Oh, I do. You can play a little game and go to these sites and actually see what's happening on the ground. And when you drive through Kitimat, you might see a sign that says Kitimat LNG, and you might go, ooh, Kitimat LNG. Closer inspection, you realize it's just a closed Eurocan pulp mill that's got a different sign slapped on it. So you drive further down the road, you see LNG Canada, Shell. You go, ooh, what's that? Well, then you realize it's just a shut down Methanex facility with another sign on it. You go to Prince Rupert and say, what's happening there? Well, what you see is 2 lovely islands with lots of trees on it, and these are the supposed LNG facilities. There's nothing really of substance going on. There's some due diligence going on, which is what you would expect. Petronas, the one that's announced at least 3 times that it's going to ship LNG, this Malaysian company, hasn't got its supply tied up yet. It's still proving up its reserves because it bought up the Talisman fields. And they're going for a specific supply gap in Asia that may not exist if they don't meet the timeline. So it's very, the problem is British Columbia's gone all in on one thing with no backup plan. And that's irresponsible. And I think I'm going to actually quote Preston Manning on that right here. At a recent conference, he said the following: "We shouldn't count our chickens before the rooster even enters the hen house." So to kind of mix that metaphor up and just build it up, we are in British Columbia putting all our eggs in one basket. And we're counting the chickens before the rooster has even entered the hen house. It makes no sense, and there's no backup plan. So we are in real trouble in BC if, and frankly when, companies start pushing their investment decisions off into the future. I'll give you one example of the type of spin that really drives me crazy. It's here. This was at a conference that was, the Clean Energy Conference that was done in 2012. And here is the projected price gap between the Asian price for natural gas and the US price. Essentially, if you just asked somebody to draw 2 straight lines and just have them make some pattern up to the future, it's the same. It's just the same price gap going out forever. I mean, this is absurd. But this is essentially what is based on this $1 trillion, 100,000, blah, blah, blah. Oh, another one is 150-year supply. I mean, the numbers just don't add up. So now we're starting to move into expectation management. Has anyone done the BC LNG quiz online? I encourage you to do it. Now you start at, the questions are really are involving expectation management. Now it's talking about what is the government's goal for 2020? Well, it was 5, but now it's 3 in the quiz. So it's starting to move down that track. So what do I think? I think gas is cleaner than coal. I think there's potential if it's done right. I think it's a pipe dream that it's going to be some economic panacea for all of us here in British Columbia. And frankly, with no backup plan, I think it's irresponsible to throw all our eggs in that basket. But yes?
If I can continue on with gas in northern BC example, what's your opinion or thoughts about whether it's LNG or whether it's a slower process for developing, and there's lots of development happening there now, the lack of a regional cumulative effects assessment with respect to government input into it. Can you talk about that?
Sure. This is what, it's in BC, it's often what happens, it's patchwork progress, as opposed to standing back and having an overall strategy. So you're right, there's been no cumulative environmental impact assessment in the region. And it's ironic though, I don't know that there's as much development going on there as people think. Fort Nelson, for example, is really suffering because it requires $5 per million BTU to get gas out of the ground in Fort Nelson. And they can't get that price now. So, and Encana recently sold its, I mean, yeah, it was Encana sold its BC plays, and they laid off a substantive fraction of their workplace. So in the Fort St. John region, there are some, Talisman got out of the game, sold it to Petronas. There is some activity. There's no doubt.
Like the graph, it goes up and down, and when it's up, there's no pain.
Yeah. That's right. It's right now the mentality is it's a bit of a gold rush mentality. Find the field, stake the claim, dig the ground, away you go. So, but there is no. I mean, now it's there's troubling developments too about bringing in the Agricultural Land Commission into the Oil and Gas Commission, things like that, which are a little disturbing. So developments are, yeah, we do need some greater oversight to that. Yes.
You said that one of the positive things that Gordon Campbell did was to introduce the targets and climate change. Did you participate in the actual target setting, or do you know how
Yes.
it came up with the 80% figure?
Yeah. Actually, there was actually I should say that there are a number. It's not just the greenhouse gas legislation. There was a whole bunch of policies. I mean, that's what was so important, is that it wasn't one policy. It was a potpourri of policies that you can, like bells and like knobs and switches, that you can actually adjust to actually get the answer you want. Coming out with the 80%, 33%. The 33% number is essentially some. I mean, it's a number halfway between the European 20 and 40% that was being discussed. The 80% is scientifically based. That's essentially where you got to be on a pathway for a developed world. If we wanted to transition, the only solution is actually getting us to close to zero with negative emissions. And 80% is a science-based number of where you should be for the developed world if you want to do that in a sustainable way, an economically viable way by 2050. The 33% was just some number, and then, well, Europe was talking 20% and 40%, and so we came up with 33. It was meetable, totally meetable, because, and then the interim numbers between 2020 and 2009 were set by the Climate Action Team, which I was part of, and so we actually came up with the 12 and 16% based on specific policy measures that could have been put in place and were put in place and what they were projected to do. The problem came about with this frenzy towards LNG. And with the there's a real problem there that's not spoken of. It's the fugitive emissions and the woeful underestimation that the provincial government has done of the fugitive emissions. From fugitive emissions are excess flaring or just stuff that escapes. And when the numbers get revised, it's going to be really not looking so good up in that region. But final question. Yeah.
You talked about how the lines have crossed between emissions in the developing world and emissions in the developed world.
Yes.
In the developed world, we've flatted and how it's dramatically increasing the red line in the developing world. But to what extent is that increase in the developing world a result of exploitation by companies from the developed world?
That's a great question, and I wish I had the figure is available. People have done the exported emissions, it's called. So what, you know, the shutdown of the manufacturing in Ontario, shift to increased manufacturing in China, and it's less environmentally friendly manufacturing. So it's substantial, but cannot explain this amount. So what it does is it brings this curve, this 58% comes down to about here, and the 42 goes up to about here. They still don't cross. I don't have the number exactly, but it's on my computer here somewhere. I could get it. And what I should say is the big growth is largely because of Chinese growth in coal-fired electricity production. That is the single biggest growth sector. And we do some shipping things like in Alberta, when you upgrade bitumen and refine bitumen, you end up with this thing called pet coke, which is just nasty. So it's nasty stuff. So what do? We ship it to Asia and they burn it. So in some sense, we're also shipping the crap that's piling up around Detroit. We're shipping to China and they're burning it for electricity production.
You also talked about spin. I just wanted to touch on one item about spin. That's the Koch brothers.
Yeah.
The U.S. company that funds a lot of the climate change denial money. How much money are they putting into, continuing to put into denying climate change versus how much, for example, are they putting into sponsoring the science program on television?
I don't know that answer. It sounds like a rhetorical question because I suspect you do know that answer. Oh, you don't know the answer? No, I don't know that answer. And well, you know, I don't like to pick out individuals, but I will say that Koch brothers are not known for funding climate science within the U.S. So I mean, I do believe actually they did. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I take that back. I think they funded the fellow, the Berkeley. They were involved. Might have been involved in the funding of the Berkeley fellow who was re-looking at the global temperature. I forget his name. Global temperature record. The best record. This is the Berkeley and Earth System temperature record. I mean, the arrogance of this fellow to think that, you know, he can do, and what hundreds of people have been doing around the world for many years, he can suddenly do a better job. It's just, he gets the same result, of course. But anyway, I believe that there might have been some funding in there. So, I mean, I don't worry about these guys anymore. I don't worry about the people. It's, you know, life's too short to worry about the people. If you focus on them, you just get hung up on them. It's just time to move forward. Leave them behind. And people are moving forward, and they want to move forward. And, you know, to score a little political thing, look at Oak Bay Gordon Head. This is, I mean, we have a, where I live in Gordon Head, we have a Green MP and a Green MLA. I mean, it's like, I think you're going to see more of that because people are fed up with status quo politics, and they're, you know, they're willing to look for differences. And I think there will be more of that. Yeah. Thanks. I'll pull this off.
So thank you very much, Andrew Weaver, for setting the stage in our conversation of wicked problems. I was having a conversation with one of my cohort, Jarrett, the other day about being super excited about being in a room with a bunch of people who want to talk about the same stuff you do. I'm super amped heading into our next sessions. I'd really like to say, thank Andrew Weaver for just pointing out that we're actually living in a really exciting time, a time of innovation, a time for change, where these discussions are happening, and I'm really excited that we'll all be heading off into the next sessions to really think about what kind of decisions we can make as a group and as people to contribute to changing the future and thinking about sustainability.
With that, I'll get a little closer to the mic here. I understand I've been a little quiet. I want to start us off in the transition into the panel section. So if you all have your, I'm going to be our like flight attendant here, our guide. If you flip to the middle page, that's going to give you the summary of all of the panels. And just